Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and once again, I am happy to be with you here on this 19th Sunday after Pentecost. It is October 20th already. We're just cruising right along through these texts, aren't we? Well, through the year, really. It's almost Halloween, almost the end of October, so that means we're getting up there to Thanksgiving and Christ the King Sunday and Advent and Christmas, and whoosh, there goes the year, both calendar and liturgical. But let's go ahead and talk about some texts for this week, shall we? As always, the texts are for this current Sunday. We follow a lectionary cycle, and so this is the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, meaning it's been 19 weeks since we celebrated Pentecost, and we have this very long season of Pentecost, or ordinary time, kind of a season between seasons, if you will. If you think of seasons like Lent or Advent, kind of contained short seasons. This is still a season. It's just not quite as, I don't want to say well known. What am I looking for? Thematic, maybe. Advent and Lent definitely have very specific themes. Easter as well. So, it's a longer time. It's ordinary time, and that makes sense when you realize that it's just kind of this time between all of Easter and Pentecost, and then Advent. So that's probably enough of that. Let's talk about the text. The first one comes to us from the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verses 22 through 31. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. This story fascinates me, always has, wrestling with God for the whole night and prevailing, God not being able to get the upper hand in this wrestling match with Jacob. That just seems somewhat impossible, doesn't it? You would think that God would always have the upper hand in wrestling. And the funny thing is that my husband's upstairs right now watching WWE. Totally different kind of wrestling, but definitely gives me an image in my head, and I don't want to think about that because God as a WWE wrestler just makes me laugh. Anyway, not that kind of wrestling. But there's a lot of symbolism in this story. There's a lot of probably metaphor, but there's a lot going on in this story. Not least of which is the wrestling, and that Jacob prevails. And doesn't seem quite fair that Jacob prevails, so he gets his hip put out of socket. But let's look at some commentary and see what we can find out about this text from Genesis and the story of Jacob becoming Israel. That's a very important moment in the history of Israel, of course, because we know that at this point, 11 sons are going to be the 12 sons and the 12 tribes of Israel, and we get the story of Joseph and the trip and his going to Egypt, and then, all kinds of stuff come from this moment. So the commentator, Callie Plunkett Bruton, who is the campus minister at the University of North Alabama in Florence, Alabama, kind of starts out her commentary the way I started out. She says, it's a profoundly mysterious story with numerous unanswerable questions. Yes, ma'am. She says, a lone human being wrestles through the night with a nameless antagonist and emerges from the night transformed. This story is so often repeated in human existence that the reader scarcely realizes that this is an ancient story. Because it involves the theme of human transformation, it is a familiar and compelling narrative to people of all times. So the narrative, she says, begins with a puzzle. Why does Jacob go to all the trouble of fording the Jabbok with his wives and children only to head back across it to spend the night alone? The questions only multiply as the story continues. Who is this being with whom Jacob wrestles, and what prompts this night-long battle? What is the significance of all the names at the end of this chapter, especially the new name Jacob receives? As the dawn breaks, we can't help but ask what sort of blessing Jacob has received as he limps back to his family. There may be too many types of these questions to answer in any single commentary or sermon or Bible study, depending on how long that Bible study is. But, that's okay. So questions are good. And you may have more that we didn't even cover, that I didn't cover or Callie didn't cover in that paragraph. So she goes on to say that there are some clues in the narrative as well as the larger context of chapter 32 of Genesis that can help us to open up some of these questions, although they don't necessarily provide definitive answers to all of the questions, including why Jacob is alone and vulnerable that night. Robert Alter, she says, points out that binary division, i.e. doubling, is a recurring motif in the stories of Jacob. Jacob and his twin brother Esau divide over a birthright and a blessing. Jacob's two wives are sisters who are divided against one another as they vie for his affection. Jacob also makes a fortune dividing his flocks into multi- and party-colored animals. As Jacob makes his return to his homeland and a reunion with Esau in this chapter, we find him anxious to trick or appease his brother. So he desperately divides his property into two camps, hoping Esau and his men will attack one camp and not the other. He then divides his tribute to his brother among not just two, but into three different groups of his servants. Jacob keeps dividing his property and household into smaller and smaller camps until he ends up alone. Thus, we can see that his strange departure from his family is consistent with the narrative about Jacob up to this point. His is a story of division and separation. This is an incredibly dramatic night for Jacob, and it actually mirrors another dramatic night, which is the night that he fled from his brother and Canaan. In that narrative, he lays his head on a stone and has a dream. That's the dream of Jacob's ladder. He also marks that place so that he can remember it and names it. So now he's kind of come full circle. He's coming back to his brother. He has another very significant night, and this time he has not just a dream, but an actual encounter, a divine encounter. So Jacob clings to his adversary, as we know, and demands a blessing when the adversary is not able to prevail. Jacob supplies his name when the adversary asks him of it, and then he is renamed Israel because, as his adversary says, you have striven with Elohim and with human beings and have prevailed. The name Jacob was given to him at birth to mark his efforts to supplant his brother even in the womb. Now he's given another name that matches his story of striving and overcoming all that stands in his way, including dangerous supernatural beings, and he's given another blessing. While the details of that blessing aren't part of the narrative, the narrator does make clear that he is blessed, and unlike the blessing stolen from his brother by trickery, this blessing is earned. He is transformed, and now he's Israel. As he limps away, wounded and blessed, he's amazed at the experience, and in a move that recalls his earlier experience in Genesis 29, he gives the place of his wrestling a name. Peniel, which is Hebrew for the face of God /God. This reflects Reflecting not on his injury nor his upcoming reunion with his brother, he is quietly amazed that he survived the night as he makes his way back to his family in the early dawn. Morning finds him focused and ready for whatever is to come. So this story is definitely about persistence, and that's something that we are going to encounter more of as we read through today's texts. We are going to take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll turn our attention to the psalm assigned for today. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about Jacob's transformation into Israel, Jacob's wrestling with God, Jacob's persistent, which is going to be a theme that comes up again in the Gospel. But now we are turning our attention to Psalm 121, which is one of my absolute favorite psalms. I spoke recently about my time working at a Lutheran summer camp in Montana, and that is when I really learned to love this psalm, because I was surrounded by mountains and I was desperately seeking help, and those mountains gave me comfort and courage, and I definitely felt God's presence in those mountains as I struggled through that summer. So Psalm 121 is as follows. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore. I love that psalm, Psalm 121, and it is completely understandable why this is often read at funerals, along with Psalm 23. I think those two may be the most read psalms at funerals, definitely Psalm 23, but there is so much comfort in this. It starts out with kind of a plaintive question, from where will my help come? And it is immediately answered. My help comes from the Lord. My help comes from the one who made heaven and earth. Really, what more can you ask for, right? God created everything. God will not let your foot be moved. God who watches over you doesn't sleep. God is constantly watching over you. There is no time when God is not caring for you, protecting you, keeping you in God's loving embrace, because you are a child of God. The Lord will keep your life. And then this last part is really where a lot of the funeral imagery comes into play. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore. So as you leave the house in the morning, or whenever it is that you leave the house to go to work or go out to accomplish your tasks for the day, whether that's errands or work or school or what have you, you leave the house, God is with you. You come back to the house, God is still with you. God will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore. Doesn't matter if you're leaving home for the first time, you're headed to college, maybe you're moving home because of life circumstances and you're moving back in with your parents. God is there. God is keeping your going out and your coming in from now until forever. Always has, always will. Even when things seem scary or desperate or just plain blah, there is comfort in knowing that God is there. So this psalm, the first lines of the psalm might not make as much sense if you live somewhere really, really flat and always have. I know people who don't like mountains. They don't. I grew up in Montana, as I said, and the eastern part of the state is very, very flat, and the western part of the state is very mountainous. In fact, the eastern part of the state is on the eastern part of the side of the Rockies, and the western part is the Rockies and over. So, I have a friend who grew up on the eastern part of the state, and she now lives on the western part of the state, but she always says it makes her feel claustrophobic. And when she crosses the mountains and heads into eastern Montana and things open up into the prairies and the flatlands, she just has this huge sigh of relief. So maybe for her, the mountains aren't as comforting as they are for me. I grew up in the western part of the state. I grew up in a tiny town, a valley that is surrounded by mountains. So for me, that makes me feel safe. It makes me feel protected. When I am in eastern Montana, I feel a little exposed. I feel a little like, whew, I can see too far. There is, eastern Montana has the most beautiful, beautiful sunsets, but I'm a western Montana girl, and I like those mountains. When I lived in Texas, I was constantly lost because there were no mountains. I had no point of reference to figure out which direction I was heading. I am terrible at directions anyway. I'm directionally challenged. So, not having any mountains when I lived in Texas, because I lived where it's flat. Lost. Lived there for 3 years. Think I was pretty much lost the entire time, but that's probably a metaphor for another day. Let's go ahead and maybe look at some commentary on this instead of me just, yammering on. Psalm 121 is a psalm of ascent. This, according to Amy Erickson, Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. It is the second psalm in a collection used by Israelites making pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which makes sense. This does sound like a travel psalm. Pilgrimage has been understood in a number of different ways, but recent attempts at definition emphasize that this is not merely a religious or spiritual phenomenon, although it is that as well, but a social, political, and commercial one as well. It is a physical, ritualized journey undertaken through a particular landscape and often at a particular time to a destination that has been ascribed religious power, whether that be a place, a person, or an object. Upon arrival, the pilgrim offers prayers and sacrifices that will be particularly power and efficacious because of the holiness concentrated in the place. She says that Mark S. Smith writes that pilgrimage to the Jerusalem temple was like visiting paradise and temporarily recapturing the primordial, peaceful, and abundant relationship with God. I love this image of pilgrimage. So often we think of pilgrimage as solo, but if you really think about the pilgrimages that you read about in the Bible, think about when Jesus is 12 and he travels with his parents to Jerusalem. They're traveling in a group, not just as a family, but in a very large group, so large that they don't notice that Jesus is missing, right? They don't realize until after traveling for a day that their 12-year-old has gone missing. Anyway, Amy Erickson goes on to write that perhaps because many modern Christians feel increasingly alienated from the landscape, from the rhythm of the seasons, and from their own bodies, pilgrimage has become a powerful way for Christians to link aspects of their lives that they have tended to hold separate. For instance, the spiritual and the material, the body and the soul, the community and the individual. They go on pilgrimage in search of a full and intense experience of the divine. That's, I think, a really interesting way to look. I'm going to need to think more about pilgrimage and what my idea of pilgrimage is. And I don't think I've ever intentionally taken a pilgrimage, or if I have, I didn't think of it in that way. I mean, we do pilgrimages all the time, right? We travel to places that are important to us. We travel to places that are holy to us. But do we think about them as being pilgrimages? So the psalm begins with a recognition that the world is full of uncertainty, that fear threatens to uproot experiences of security and safety. So the question of where does our help come from? You can tell that that's sort of fraught with fear, with uncertainty. Where is my help going to come from? We're setting out on this journey. From where is our help? But the answer comes very quickly, as we know in verse 2. Our help comes from God. Our help comes from the one who made heaven and earth, who did so many different things. And so in the midst of maybe fear and uncertainty, the pilgrim chooses to travel into the heart of holiness. The pilgrim still chooses to travel, even though things are uncertain, even though the road might be dangerous. This is what the pilgrim finds comfort in, that God is going with him or her. The psalm builds, she says, through a series of expansions, that and so much more response to the initial question, which is, from where will my help come? God will make sure in this moment that your foot will not slip, but God will do so much more than that. God will be your shade, a comfort in the sun-baked region of Jerusalem. The image draws on the metaphor of God as a raptor who covers his offspring with his wings, as well as on metaphors of God as a fortress that provides shelter and refuge. Because of this God shade, if you will, you don't need to fear the scary things that threaten at night or during the day. And so it just gets more expansive, and the imagery becomes more expansive, and there's this assurance of protection, not only during the day and the night, but you're going out and you're coming in forever. And I don't know. This psalm is just all beautiful to me. It is always going to be one of my favorites. But the journey metaphor, she says, holds this psalm together, and it works on a number of levels. As the pilgrim affirms that the protective presence of God accompanies him or her on their journey to Jerusalem, they are invited to make associations between their individual life trajectories and the story of Israel's relationship with God. In this way, each pilgrim is invited to recall the ways in which God has cared for them, while also seeing their journey as part of Israel's journey. The psalm also gives each pilgrim a language and a tradition that binds them to the community, past and present. And all this collective and individual remembering is prompted not by a private reading, but through communal singing, which happens as the people walk together, moving through the landscape, united by a common purpose and a shared destination, which pretty much just makes me love this psalm more. Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be turning our attention to the New Testament and the reading from 2 Timothy. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about Psalm 121, or maybe I was gushing about Psalm 121 because it is one of my favorites. But we turn our attention, as I said, now to the New Testament texts. And our first reading from the epistles is from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14 through chapter 4, verse 5. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have known the sacred writings that are able to instruct you for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. In the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and in view of his appearing in his kingdom, I solemnly urge you, proclaim the message. Be persistent, whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. Convince, rebuke, and encourage with the utmost patience in teaching. For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths. As for you, always be sober, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, carry out your ministry fully. Again, that is 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14 through chapter 4, verse 5. And wow, that what struck me this time, I don't know what jumped out at you, but it was that itching ears part that really jumped off the page at me this time. Be persistent. I've mentioned persistence is a theme for this week. But be persistent whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. But then the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires. Having itching ears, I guess meaning having a need to listen to other doctrines and, having an open mind. Listening is not a bad thing, but you're supposed to also be persistent, hold fast and firm to your faith and what you have been taught and sound doctrine. So we can so easily be led astray. So I guess maybe itching ears is kind of that need to listen to things that we maybe shouldn't be listening to. Commentary from Carl Jacobson, senior pastor of the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, says, once again, in these verses from chapters 3 and 4 of 2 Timothy, Timothy is being exhorted to continue in and remain firm in what he has learned from Paul, which he puts in quotes because we, of course, aren't sure that this was actually written by Paul, but be that as it may. If persistence is a theme of these texts, persistence is definitely a theme of Paul's writing, whether it's actually Paul's writing or, just imitation of Paul's writing. Be persistent, hold firm, stand fast, etc. And these letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, are certainly along that line, along that theme of being persistent in your faith, standing firm, holding true, all of those good things. So he says the reason for what Paul is writing is that what I was just talking about. For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths. He says, while this has surely always been a challenge to believers, in some ways it seems right now that challenge is particularly great. Not only are there other gospels and rival religious narratives, we live in a golden age of storytelling. Television and film, as well as novels and podcasts, are able to tell stories about redemption, about life and death, about creation and visions of apocalypse in ways that may be deeply attractive. We may be really drawn to those. There's so many dystopian novels out there, right? So many post-apocalyptic stories. And so it is into the white noise of contending, if not opposing, stories that seek to provide meaning and purpose for life that Paul's gospel nutshell of Jesus the Christ, raised from the dead, a descendant of David, is to be spoken. So he says he would describe this climate as challenging, not something more serious sounding, because there is still something deeply provocative, alarming, and attractive to this gospel story. It is different than any other story that is told. It is life out of real death. It is strength that looks like weakness. It gives the lie to false stories of dishonest progress and unreflective growth. It is the work of the evangelist, the one who tells the good news. Such work requires just what Paul outlines: persistence, conviction, law, and gospel. That is the calling to which all of us, especially maybe preachers when they're talking about this text, or podcasters when they're talking about this text, are entrusted. But all of us, when we're telling the story of Jesus, right, we've been entrusted with a narrative. We've been entrusted with a sacred narrative. He says the second striking thing about this text is that sentence, all scripture is inspired by God and is useful. He says it's striking because on the one hand, it may seem like an absolute claim that is perfect in the face of rival or alternative narratives in our culture. This sounds to many like a claim of pure truth and an antidote to stories that don't matter, or worse, lie. But what lies at the heart of that word, inspired, is much more profoundly theological than any claim to literal or infallible truths about the Bible text, the biblical text. Inspired in Greek, he says, is theopneustos, which can literally be understood as something like God breathed. God breathed. Like, it's God hyphenated breathed. So think of it not like, and then God breathed, but as this element, or this creation story has an element of God breath through it, to it, I don't quite know how to describe it. I hope that you can picture what that means. That's the crazy thing about Greek. It's got some of these really fascinating words that are so descriptive and so evocative, but sometimes they're hard to really describe. So something like God breathed. And he says he can't help but be reminded the way God breathes in the Bible and how that breath is creative. It's life and faith giving. So he says, I take inspired, or theopneustos, here to be a summary of the way in which God and God's breath or spirit work. This is the theology at work. All scripture is a means by which God can breathe life and faith and hope and love and forgiveness and resurrection into people. That is fascinating. The theopneustos, first of all, you can now throw out a giant word that you learned in Greek, and say, you know what that means? God breathed. And then you can try to describe what that means in your own words. But I find that image fascinating, that image of the divinely inspired word, to really be helpful, that it is, because it is life-giving and it is God's breath or God's spirit at work, not only through the word, but through us as we read the word, through us as we take that word and that experience and our faith out into the world to do God's work. Let's go ahead and take our final break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll be concluding with the gospel text for this week. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Bible Study Podcast. We have been speaking about the texts assigned for the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, coming to us from the book of Genesis, from Psalm 121, and from the 3rd and 4th chapters of 2 Timothy. Now we turn our attention once again to the Gospel of Luke. We are now in chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to the judge and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Again, that is Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. And this is one of those stories that sometimes used to bug me because the unjust judge is just such a bad role model. And so often we try to make God one of the characters of a parable. But as we talked about, I don't even remember, a couple weeks ago, I don't remember which podcast that was, I apologize. God does not always have to be represented in the parable. I mean, God's always in the parable. Jesus is always talking about faith, talking about his and our relationship with God. But in this case, what we want to focus on is the widow. We have this judge who neither fears God nor has respect for people. So he's pretty much just living life for himself, doing what he needs to do. And this is unfortunately the judge whom this widow comes to present her issue, her case. She says, grant me justice against my opponent. We don't know anything about this widow. We know that she has some legal issue that she would like to have addressed. We know that widows are very vulnerable in this society because they have lost their husband, and that was, that's a source of their security and their status, etc. Widows were very, very vulnerable in the society, especially if they didn't have a son to take care of them. We have no idea if she has a son who is taking care of her. We have no idea what the issue that she needs dealt with is. But we know that she is vulnerable. We know that any kind of legal issue would hurt her because of that vulnerability, because of that place that she is in society. No matter what it is, she wants justice against this opponent who, in theory, is taking something away from her that may be harming her life. Maybe it was property that I don't know, because she didn't really have rights to property, but we don't know. I could speculate all day. You can speculate all day. And so the judge doesn't care. The judge really doesn't give a hooey about this woman, and he just keeps sending her away. But then it dawns on him, I don't care about this woman, but I do care about myself, and my standing in this community maybe will be hurt if I don't look like I'm helping her. And he says, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. And in the sermon I heard this morning, the pastor said that literally translated that she doesn't give me a black eye. So she doesn't, that's a very visible sign in society something has happened, and he doesn't care about other people, but I think he cares about what other people think. He cares about his own standing. So he doesn't want people to think of him in a certain way, even though he's an unjust judge. So he grants her justice, which is great for the woman. And he wouldn't have done that if she hadn't been persistent, if she hadn't kept bothering him so that he started worrying about her wearing him out, or her giving him a black eye, her making him look bad in the community. So this is not God. This is not saying keep praying to God like a small toddler, like that scene in Family Guy where the baby just keeps saying, Mom, 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 Mommy, Mom, 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 Mom. Right? That's not the way we're supposed to pray. We're not supposed to pray until God says, what? Because God is not the unjust judge, finally giving in to our persistence. No, what it's saying is if this man who just doesn't care finally gives in because of persistence, how much more is God, who loves us, who does care, who cares so very much about us? How much more is God going to listen? Is God going to help us? Is God going to answer our prayer? And Jesus, that Jesus is still trying to teach his disciples and as well as prepare them for what's to come. We need to be prepared for what's to come, because Advent is coming when we get a little of apocalyptic texts. But Jesus is still trying to prepare his disciples, and this last sentence kind of points to that. I tell you, God will quickly grant them justice, and yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? You got to think, wow, well, okay, so that took a turn. It's about persistence. It is about praying always and not losing heart. This woman, we don't know if she lost heart, but she certainly did not give up. She was persistent. And I read a text, not yesterday, today, I read a text from Diana Butler Bass, who said that she preached on this morning, and she called her sermon "Nevertheless." She persisted, and she said after the service, she was greeting people as they were leaving the church, and a man came up to her and he said, "I want you to know that I'm a judge, but I think I'm a fair judge." And behind him, she said, it was perfect timing. Behind him, she said, there was a woman who said, "Well, I'm a feisty woman, and you can bet I persist." Or a feisty widow. I'm a feisty widow. Something along those lines. I should have looked the text up to read it to you to read the actual words to you. But I was like, that is awesome. I love when things like that just kind of come together. But, Luke definitely has this concern for the poor. He has a concern for the vulnerable. So we get this widow who is persisting, who is resisting the exploitation to which she's being subjected. And this is from some commentary, I should have mentioned that, by Brittany E. Wilson, assistant professor of New Testament at Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina. Like other widows before her, such as Tamar in Genesis 38 and Ruth and Naomi, the widow in Luke takes matters into her own hands. Her persistence and call for justice is such that the judge characterizes her actions as those of a boxer. It is difficult to discern this boxing image in the translation that we read. You know, you're probably thinking, I didn't hear anything about that, which translates the judge's words, because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. In the original Greek, though, the judge says, because this widow causes trouble for me, I will give her judges so that she may not, in the end, give me a black eye by her coming. By using the verb hypopiazo? Oh, I'm so sorry, Dr. Smith, for my terrible, and Dr. Both of my, wow. Now I'm sorry for forgetting my other Greek professor's name. Geez, that's terrible. For that horrible Greek pronunciation. But, it means to give a black eye, and Luke situates the judge's language within the arena of boxing metaphors. However, when we translate this, it doesn't really capture the meaning of that verb. We get a slightly softer version of that, but I love that boxing metaphor. She says that those softer translations obscure the humor that Luke often infuses into this, or that Luke infuses into the scene. We're probably meant to laugh at this topsy-turvy picture of a lowly widow pummeling a recalcitrant arbiter of justice. But as New Testament scholar F. Scott Spencer rightly recognizes, the humor in this scene is not one of comic relief. The humor in this scene instead pokes fun at the powers that be, which happens so often in Luke. And he is quoted as saying, lampooning and upending the unjust system stacked against widows, orphans, immigrants, and the like. She goes on to say, like our political cartoons today, Jesus' parable encourages us to laugh at those who wield their power unethically. We laugh, though, in order to challenge such figures and ultimately to offer a different way. So, nevertheless, she persisted. I think this gives us that this reminds us that we need to be persistent, not to get our own way, but to get justice, to seek justice. We can't just say, well, that didn't work, I'm going to give up. I guess, justice isn't going to happen today. Be persistent, whether that's in your relationship with God or your relationship with the world around you. If you're passionate about something and you're seeking justice, don't just give up at the first sign of trouble. Be persistent. But I do want to address that question of when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And by ending, she says, on a question of whether he will find faith at his return, Jesus raises a number of additional questions for us. How do followers not lose heart and maintain the faith in light of the fact that Jesus is not returning as soon as many would like? I mean, it's been over 2,000 years, right? How are we to act if God's justice is not delivered according to our own timetable? Always a good question. How do we go on in the face of injustice if God's ultimate justice only arrives suddenly at Jesus' return? In response to such questions, Luke maintains that we are to act like the widow. We are not to wait quietly for Jesus' return and accept our fates in an oppression-ridden world. We are instead to resist injustice with the resolve and constancy of the widow. As Jesus explains elsewhere, prayer is not a passive activity, but one that actively seeks God and pursues God. Like the widow, we are to persevere in the faith, crying out to God day and night. That, she says, is what persistent prayer looks like. You can think of it as, where does my help come from? Psalm 121, my help comes from God. Therefore, I will be persistent. I will continue to implore God. I will continue to do God's work in this world, to strive for justice, to do all of those, to do that work that Jesus started and we are called to continue. So thank you so much for joining me. It's time to wrap this up. Join me again next week when we will turn our attention to the next week is Reformation Sunday. So I may talk about the Reformation texts being a good Lutheran, or I may talk about the other assigned text, or maybe I'll do a combination thereof. But it's either going to be Reformation Sunday or the 20th Sunday after Pentecost, or the 20th Reformation Sunday after Pentecost, which isn't a thing. Thank you, as always, for joining me. Please, if you are a fan of this podcast, go ahead and subscribe, like our social media text posts, share those posts, tell your friends, give us a nice 5-star review if you wouldn't mind. That really helps us out in terms of getting not only my word, but hopefully God's word to more listeners, to more people. It's not about what I say, but it's about God working through my words. And so if you can subscribe, share, review, do all those things, then you can help me to get that word to more people. So thank you so much for your work in this world, and thank you so much for being a listener. Hope you have a wonderful week, and as always, please do remember that you are a beautiful and beloved child of God. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.